So, um, hi everybody, let's start. I will start by introducing myself. My name is Adam Corsini. I'm the Senior Collections Engagement Manager here at the Jewish Museum London, and really pleased to welcome you all to today's lunchtime talk, which is called The Lines of a New Horizon, Mapping the Jews' Temporary Shelter. So to give a little bit of context before I introduce our speaker, in July last year, we reopened the museum after the lockdowns, and part of the changes that we made were to reinterpret and change what used to be our temporary exhibition space into a research centre, which gives us the options of having items on display. We've got our research library, which is open access for our visitors, but we also have a space which is designated for digitising our collection. And one of the first collections that we wanted to work on was a set of cards from the Jews Temporary Shelter, which will be the subject of today's talk. As we started to work on these cards, we realized that there was some really interesting information there, but we wanted different ways to present this information. So it was really fortunate that we were able to receive a bit of funding from the Audience Agency. And also that allowed us to work with the fantastic Lewis Smith, who is today's talker. And he's a PhD student and researcher from Essex University. And I'm sure he'll be telling us a little bit more about himself in a moment. But today's talk will focus on the work that Lewis has been doing with us and how we've been taking the information from these original records cards from the 1940s and 50s and discovering new things. So I think on that note, what I'll do is I'll pass over to Lewis. Just before I do, just the standard Zoom rules apply, where I ask that people keep their microphones on mute until the end, and there will be a chance to ask questions at the end. And if you do have any questions throughout, please feel free to just write those in the chat, and then we'll answer those at the end of the talk as well. So without further ado, I will pass over to Lewis and let yourself introduce yourself.
Thank you very much indeed. All right, so let's share screen. So I'll do the standard talk start for every talk that happens on Zoom. Can you see my screen? Awesome. That's going to be I'm sure that's going to be the new kind of art attack. Here's one I did before, but anyway, thank you, Adam. Thank you for that very kind introduction. In many respects, it's both a great pleasure to be here speaking and at the same time a great loss, as this does represent one of the final engagements as part of this project. And it feels almost very strange that it's been 3 months. Actually, it's felt more like 5 minutes. So I'm both very happy to be here doing this and very upset at the same time. Just very, very, very briefly about me. I do far too much. I've got so many different roles in so many different places, but just kind of brief overview of what I'm doing currently at the moment. So I'm a PhD student at the University of Essex in the Department of History. And first and foremost, I research modern British history. So my thesis, which, funnily enough, my supervisor thought it would be a lovely idea to send me the email just before this talk. So I'm now really, really nervous about reading that email with some feedback. But that's on the British Overseas Airways Corporation and their pursuit of kind of their mobilization in the post-war period. You'll know them today as British Airways, but I look at kind of their corporate history and how they kind of tie into Britain's post-war context. I also do many other things with many other organizations. So I'm a transport and mobility history seminar convener at the IHR, another fantastic organization. Highly recommend that you have a look at some of the talks they've got on offer. And I've also done quite a lot of work with other museums. So I've done some stuff with the Essex Record Office here in, not here in Colchester, here in Essex. And above all, I've been working as a research associate with the lovely people at the Jewish Museum in London, where we've been working on this project. I'd also just like to apologise. It's the last week of term, and there are, from what I can only describe as very excitable undergraduates on campus. So, I mean, that could lead to some parades and shouting outside. I do apologise, but we'll play that as it happens. So I've been working on the project called Mapping the Jewish Temporary Shelter, which is kind of seen as a pilot project. So it's supported by the Audience Agency's Digitally Democratizing Archives project from DCMS and the National Lottery as part of the Heritage Fund's Digital Skills for Heritage initiative. So there are a few different angles that we're initially taking here. So we're primarily kind of seeing this as a digital thing, as kind of a digital project. And we're trying to kind of extrapolate the digital element out of this. As I always tell many people, as historians don't like computers. So I'd like to buck that trend that I love computers and I love history. So I'm merging the two together. So what we're trying to do in this project is we're trying to raise engagement with this particular collection of cards, because there's a lot of potential in this collection as to hopefully, as you'll see as the talk goes on. But primarily, I'll go into a little bit more depth about these specific sources as we go through. But I feel it probably makes sense to start off with a bit about the temporary shelter itself. So the Jewish temporary shelter has been around since 1885. It's got a wide history spanning from the 19th century well into the 21st. So it was founded in 1885 to help Jewish immigrants and refugees, often arriving with extremely little, to find their feet in London. The key kind of motivation for founding this shelter was through the many of the kind of the turmoil happening, much of the turmoil happening in Russia, which in the 1880s had experienced waves of anti-Jewish riots, which swept across several regions, not just of Russia, but of many different parts of empire, and eventually leading to more than 2 million Jews fleeing Russia between 1880 and 1920. Noting this huge increase, a baker by the name of Samuel Cohen, also called Simcha, opened the unused parts of his bakery on Church Lane in East London into a shelter for the homeless and jobless. In fact, he used the unoccupied portions of his bakery to quote, as a dining and sitting room in the daytime, as many people slept in the bakery on bags of flour and on improvised beds at night. Cohen's shelter was by far and away not fit for purpose. It was fulfilling a need at a time of urgency. So much so that it was very quickly closed down in 1885 as a sanitary inspector decided that it was not ideal. This eventually led to its shifting. It's moved a couple of times in its history. So first of all, it moved to a different location in Garden Street, which eventually replaced the provisional flour sacks. This was eventually abandoned in April 1886 for a more spacious premises at 84 Le Mans Street in the heart of London. And here is a picture. Unfortunately, I don't have the date for this. I think this is early 1900s, but this is a commonly used picture on a lot of the Jewish museums' temporary shelter records. This offered 60 beds, bathing facilities, and a disinfection chamber for clothes and belongings. And interestingly, a major theme of the shelter has been cleanliness, and it's something that appears quite regularly, with one record describing it as fastidiously clean. So there's a real emphasis on kind of moving away from that makeshift shelter that happened originally in 1885, which I think is a fascinating angle. So this offered much better facilities, and throughout it served as kind of a hub of Jewish migration and Jewish kind of a network of Jewish charities in the East End, which was ideally supported, which was ideally designed to support transmigration. early on, it cooperated with organizations such as the Soup Kitchen for the Jewish poor and with the Society for Providing Strangers with meals on Sabbaths and holy days. So it not only becomes a place of transmigration, it becomes a hub of activities to support poorer Jews in London. This is a particularly fascinating image. Many historical accounts of the temporary shelter tend to stop, ironically, around the time of the Jewish cards, which was a very interesting discovery recently. And there tends to be a real emphasis on the lead up to the shelter. Perhaps likely as a result of that history of migration kind of widens as we get to the post-war era, and it tends to kind of broaden out. But for any budding historians, there is a huge gap in the literature of wartime migration within the temporary shelter. So the Jewish Museum London certainly kind of represents itself as one of the only places where a lot of this stuff can be found, very much as a unique hub of the temporary shelter. So this was taken in 1956 and pictures Hungarian and Egyptian refugees celebrating the Jewish festival of Passover at the Jews' temporary shelter in London. For those who aren't aware, so Passover Seder is a ritual feast which marks the beginning of the Jewish holiday of Passover. So I think what this image captures, perhaps more than anything, is the fact that the Jewish temporary shelter served as a center for kind of Jewish freedom and the ability to kind of follow one's faith. This was very much emphasized as a refuge, not just for Jews, but for Judaism. In most cases, in environments that were intrinsically and uncompromisingly hostile towards it. So for 100 years, it was a shelter that was miles away from the discrimination faced in places like Russia, Eastern Europe, and elsewhere in the world. So I think that's absolutely intrinsic to the shelter, is that it's not just sheltering people, it's sheltering the religion itself. And that's something that comes through in a lot of different documents. Another particularly fascinating image, and again located in the Jewish Museum's collection. This is the Isaac family who immigrated from Britain, immigrated to Britain from India in 1957. At the shelter, they lived in dormitories separated by gender, which meant that the family had to live apart. So it began partnering. So throughout the early 1900s, it began partnering with different organizations to try and start moving migrants across and throughout the world, and particularly by working with steamship companies. Again, there's probably an interesting angle there to combine that with BOAC, which is an angle of research I just stumbled across just there. But again, perhaps the core here is that it's not just a shelter for European migrants, it's for trans migrants. It's a shelter for global migration. And there is a real emphasis, particularly by some of the stuff that we'll come across later in the talk, that there is a real global element here, and it serves as a hub of global transmigration traffic. So it really does kind of focus down on the importance of this as a hub. So with that little bit of background, and by no means is that extensive a history of the temporary shelter at all, there is so much that I've neglected and kind of deliberately ignored for haste. But there is a fascinating history behind that. So I joined this project perhaps at the easiest stage. What tends to happen with museum is that you get, as a common problem amongst all museums, and as all historians will tell you, is that there is always too many sources, too much material, and not enough time or funding to do it. So when it comes to coming across these funding grants, being able to bring people on board. This is where you can really dig into some really unique collections and really start unveiling some different, never seen before stories.
That's fine.
So this was exactly the case with the temporary shelter cards. So as I've written in a blog for the project, I describe these as possibly a bit harsh, but I think generally sums it up. These are kind of mundane items of bureaucracy. So these serve as kind of the function behind the transmigration. These cards were used to record details of who was traveling through the temporary shelter, including where they were coming from, when and where they were going, ideally, although that's something we'll get to towards the end of the talk. This was coupled with perhaps the most exciting brief I get as a historian, which is, we have no idea what's in this collection. We have absolutely we couldn't sum them up at all. We don't know which dates, we don't know. Basically, this is all new. And that is quite possibly, that's a historian's bread and butter. So that here is a box of stuff, right, tell us about it. And that is in essence, my job. And I must also say, because I don't wish to take too much credit, I did join at the easiest stage because I didn't have to input any of the data. I didn't have to interpret the handwriting. All I had to do was communicate kind of the background and the ideas hidden intrinsically within these sources. So full credit to the team that got it to this stage. So I'll now kind of go over some of the data that we've got in here. I'm going to do my absolute best not to make this sound like a business presentation where I'm presenting stats. So there's a lot revealed within these cards. One of the main things, and one of the first things we wanted to establish was dates. So when were people arriving and departing? And these kind of form the core of what the collection tells us. So records dating between 1941 and 1951, with very few records located between 1942, 3, 4, or 8, as you can see here. So this documents every single card we have. The blue line representing the date in which they were described to have been admitted, and the pink line when they're described to have been departing. Again, there are complicated nuances here, which we will get into. But generally speaking, you can see spikes in 1946 and in 1950. These pertain to huge contexts, which I will get into momentarily. But just to go through another few stats, so to break those down a little bit further, so these are essentially the same statistics, but broken down by month. So you can see here that there's a real focus in March in 1946, and again in June in 1946. Again, there are contexts that will come across in time. And in the 1950s, possibly a bit more spread out, a bit more general, you can see that there are surges primarily between years, but particularly owing towards the winter of 1949 and 1950. Again, another interesting point here to raise perhaps is something that we'll get into in a bit is what is this actually telling us? Where's the history here? And that's something we'll go to. This is an absolutely brilliant breakdown of some of the statistics we had. So it also recorded nationality. And again, nationality is a very difficult thing to qualify, especially when you're looking at records that are dated well before kind of nationality means the same thing that it does today. But you can see that there is a large concentration of people from Czechoslovakia and Poland, but particularly a lot of the individuals that are describing themselves as stateless. And that's a particularly powerful term, particularly in post-war migration. So stateless is where someone's designation has been completely removed and kind of the rights of being a citizen of that nation are completely revoked. So there's a real movement of people who have almost been dropped from their nationality. Again, also Czechoslovakian is quite a complex topic at this point, as the Czech Republic kind of returns from suppression from the Nazi regime fairly quickly, but that's again something that deeply impacts its context. Another fascinating one. So this is broken down into broad kind of categories of what people had written down as their trade. Again, trade being an interesting term as well. But lots of people coming from artisan professions, and this included things like merchants, lots of buyers and sellers, lots of people who are mechanical. There was one dental mechanic, which I thought was pretty cool. Lots of people qualified themselves as domestic, and that was taken to kind of imply housework came under that. Again, there's a whole different variation of different trades. Perhaps most interestingly, though, is the fact that we've got this big unspecified box. And that qualifies pretty much everyone that didn't put down any kind of trade. But that will make sense when we look through some of the other stats as well, because the age ranges tell us why there's not a lot of people with specific trades. As you can see, again, this absolutely brilliant statistics, stuff that I wasn't expecting to come across. Lots of people put this down. This is one of the fullest categories we had. So you can see that there's quite a lot of people ranging between 12 and 20. So a lot of the people that were migrating or transmigrating were young, with a few kind of people in their late 20s, and that kind of becomes less common. Again, there's likely reasons for that, as migrants tend to be younger, tend to be the ones that are moved out. Men often are the first to be persecuted. Kind of older, middle-aged males are usually first. So there's an interesting history even behind this data. And again, possibly my favorite thing to kind of extract from this is how long people would spend at the shelter. Now, as we've already kind of seen that this is inherently meant to be a temporary shelter. So this matters lots to try and interpret why people are, why and how long people are staying for. So as you can see, that stays were generally quite short, ranging to about up to 3 days for most people. But there are a few different cases where staying at the shelter is much more involved and becomes quite a long stay. One of these, I believe, is a young girl who couldn't find, who is unable to find a place to go to. And that's quite a harrowing story that I was shown early on. And that's something that's definitely warrants more research. But these are difficult sources, because whilst they filter themselves down into nice categories, people are inherently human. So there are lots of different ambiguities and different kind of pushes and pulls that mean that the data isn't completely accurate. And there are lots and lots of inadequacies in this data. So there are lots of errors and assumptions. So not all cards were created equally, and there is no standard way of filling these cards out. So the key example of that is if you see on the top bit there where it says date of arrival and admitted on, quite often they were considered the same thing. Not always the case though. So there are lots of ones where actually they're not blended together, and there's a very explicit difference between date of arrival and date of admittance. Again, possibly due to kind of the group size of people coming in. Many different misspellings, ambiguous lines and markings. Some of these cards represented individuals, whereas others represented entire families. Often there are entire sections that aren't recorded. There's a handful of those, but in particular, means is very rarely filled out. So we interpret kind of means as kind of a sponsor, someone who would fund someone to go to the shelter. But another one that particularly bugs me as a historian is the box that allowed people to write in why they'd left home, which was almost universally left out. And that would have provided some really interesting substance. But perhaps one of the largest omissions within this is this remarks section that's at the end. Because this is where almost the background kicks in. And this is where you get all of the stories. And this is where you get a more detailed record of where people were coming from and where they were going to. So that's possibly an expansion point. I would suspect there's an interesting angle there to deal with AI and trying to get that to interpret the text that was left over. But there's an implication here in the background about what we're trying to do with history and data. So historical data like this is no doubt important. But as the Jewish Museum itself describes, every object tells a story. And this is certainly the case here. So it's broader than the collection telling a story. Each record card itself reveals a different pathway or story of an individual or a family. Again, so in many ways I've got quite an easy job coming here and making broad patterns and kind of piloting this to get more researchers in and involved. Because I can track those major changes. But throughout all of this, there are some incredible nuances that need further research. But just to go over some of these contexts, there's no reward for identifying the Second World War is crucial in the history of migration and displacement and refugees. Particularly actions within and around the British Empire and kind of the fall of Nazi Germany. So partition of India in 1948. There's the United Nations partition plan for Palestine, all having an evident impact on lots of this data. And obviously there's no way of specifically telling the direct impact on a lot of these cases. This is where we'd look at the remarks. But some of the major cases, so as we've already identified, there are quite a significant surge in 1946 of people moving. And again, I've done some research into this to kind of try and understand why there's such a movement. As we noticed that a lot of this movement stems from Czechoslovakia. This represented the largest documented migration in the collection. And Czechoslovakia, as I said before, is kind of an interesting case on the front line of the Second World War. So Hitler's ultimate goal was to remove all Czech culture. He saw it kind of as an abomination and something that didn't match with his philosophy, ultimately designating them as inferior peoples. After the Second World War, when Czechoslovakia reformed, the Czechoslovakian government insisted on a policy of treating, to quote one of their ministers, it's treating the Jews as treating the Germans as I'm gonna start that sentence again. Basically is inflicting the same kind of violence upon Germans as the Nazis had inflicted upon the Czechoslovakians, a policy of revenge. And Czechoslovakia is by no means unique in this. Many other European nations also follow similar policies of reasserting their own nationhood. but particularly in Czechoslovakia, European nationhood is a complicated and messy subject to get into, but broadly speaking, language carried with it an incredible amount of strength. And many individuals that were in Czechoslovakia were German-speaking Jews. As a result of this policy of kind of this reclaim of the Czechoslovakian culture, many of them were forced out of Czechoslovakia with nowhere left to go. In essence, these German-speaking peoples in Czechoslovakia were deported from the region, including many German-speaking Jews. So not only was this surge a result of violence and persecution of the regime in Czechoslovakia, it was also more of an administrative thing that happened upon the UK and American borders. In 1946, the British government had refused to allow individuals and only accepted group transportation. And hence is why we're seeing such large spikes in Czechoslovakians throughout 1946. And we'll see that as we get into the map as well. Been keen to show numbers as best I can. But essentially, these mass movements in Europe are really visible through this collection. One of the other major movements comes from 1950, and there's a kind of a response to the Canadian government. So in 1950, there was a huge boost of migrants heading through London to Liverpool, where they would join the SS Empress of Canada, which this image technically isn't of, although the Empress of Canada has a vast and complex history within itself, where it would continue onwards to Quebec and Montreal. Ironically, this ship would eventually sink in 1953, but Canada had historically been very anti-immigration. And there was a period throughout the late 1940s in which many historians have described them as token measures to increase the level of immigration to Canada. And what this does is this sparks a response in migrants wanting to go from the temporary shelter to Canada. And again, I think there's some fascinating recourse here to kind of follow these individuals from Canada as well. Canada is extraordinarily large, and I imagine there's quite a good history there. This was not to suggest that Canada was a bastion of pro-Jewish sentiment. There was still widespread discrimination, even at the political level, something which would only begin to subside in the 1950s. So you can see that there are some responses and reactions within this. Other broad phenomena that are noticeable within this map include less common cases, but nonetheless equally as important cases. So Britain undergoes a huge process of changing its law and immigration at this point, particularly as the image suggests, particularly as the Empire Windrush arrives in 1948 as a result of the 1948 British Nationality Act, which broadens what it means to be part of the empire. And hence, you see one or two different cases of individuals moving to the temporary shelter from places within the British Empire. Again, I could speak at length about this move trying to represent a kind of a feeling of universal empirehood, but reality was done for solely political reasons. But nonetheless, there is a surge that is directly visible. So this is leading us on perhaps to a practical view of the map that I've been designing over time. So you should be able to see the map plain and clear here. So just to give a very, very quick overview, So as I said before, so we've got different data categories that are available. So we have them broken down here. So we have the number within the Jewish Museum. We have the case as it was recorded on the card. We have the name of the individual, which is considered to GDPR compliance. Arrival date, where they've arrived from, birthplace, nationality, age, trade, date of departure, where they've departed to, and the number in the group. And I've tried to keep this as accurate as possible, not amending any information. So I'll always put in unspecified if I'm not sure of a piece of information. But to deal with the kind of the complexities of the data that we had, to pick which point would be best geo-referenced, we tried to be as inclusive as possible. So you'll notice on here that there are 4 different colors. So when you go to toggle filters, you can see that we have green and blue points and yellow and pink points. So to ignore kind of the bigger dots for the time being, we're just looking at the blue and pink dots. So these represent, let's go somewhere, so let's go to Wolverhampton. So a pink point represents somewhere that someone has settled. So as it says here, so we can click on the point. So we know that this person has gone, we know this person has settled in this location. Let's start with, actually blue would make more sense, wouldn't it? So we know that this person has settled in this location. So this is where they've been to the temporary shelter, and this is where they have come to settle themselves. And you have the reverse here. So you have, this is where this person left. This is kind of to keep the information as trying to keep as much of the information without editing as possible. When we zoom out though, some locations only gave national data. So where that's been available, when we've only had national data, we've put in things like Germany. So these bigger points represent where we only had national data. So as you can see here, we only know that this person arrived in England. We only know that they left Germany. So we've tried to keep as many different cases in as possible, and to try and highlight that they disappear at a certain level. This is something to explore. I'm reliably informed that the website is very close. It's almost en route. There'll be lots of different material on this. But I would be, it would be my failure as a historian not to recognize the importance of this moment within today. As we've no doubt seen, so there are clear comparisons here between migration and refuge in the world today, no doubt recognizable in the Ukraine crisis. But these perhaps raise interesting questions about how we can deal with refuge and refugees. As we've kind of seen before, that the temporary shelter served itself as kind of a location of kind of freedom of religion. And we've no doubt seen the British government has moved its way to introducing some not so far removed from the Second World War evacuation style policies. But it's impossible not to sense a somewhat reluctance from the British government. And the temporary shelter is perhaps an example of removing barriers of refuge, creating safe in-between spaces that are shielded away from the discrimination of the outside. And indeed, perhaps there is an issue here about refuge beyond Europe and more globally. It's the idea that migration beyond Europe, as this map reveals, that migration happens from the furthest reaches of the planet and is not isolated to Europe. Ukraine has no doubt opened up our hearts and homes, but war, refuge, and movement represent, in many ways, to a great disappointment to humanity, a constant force. And whilst we're quick to open for Ukraine, we are very, very defensive over our borders in the Channel, and very anemic when it came to different other conflicts were raging throughout the world. For instance, as the Taliban returned itself to power and people scrambled to leave Afghanistan for fear of the return of the brutal regime, our response was somewhat lackluster in relocating many different individuals. So perhaps it highlights the continued need to recognize refuge as a global issue, and in no doubt recognizing the value of temporary shelter in people's movements across Europe and the world. I feel I've given a very, very quick whistle-stop tour of the kind of things we've been doing, and there's so much more that I have missed out or failed to reveal. But perhaps that's where you come in as an audience, because that's what this project was designed to do. It's designed to bring about an interest in digging into the collection further. So thank you for listening to this talk. Hopefully you've picked some stuff up and learned something new, and hopefully I've encouraged some of you to have a look at the collection, have a look at the website that we've got coming up very shortly, and play around with the map. But otherwise, just whilst I can say it publicly, I'd also like to thank everyone at the Jewish Museum for being so accommodating, being so lovely to work with. Otherwise, thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Lewis. Just add my thanks to yours. That was a really fascinating talk, and it's lovely to see the results of your work and how we started with this set of cards, but now it's so interesting to see the results of that map and have them displayed in this new way. As Lewis said, audience members, if anyone does have a question, feel free to either put in your question into the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask it in person. If anyone has, feel free to go now. Or perhaps while you're thinking, I'll just reiterate what Lewis was saying. And we have created a little microsite on our Jewish Museum London website, which, all being well, will be available and online from next week. And that will have the data available for you. And it will also have the map which Lewis has created and shown, which you can navigate around and click on those dots to pop up the information in those boxes. So that'll be on our collection side of the website under our research pages, research center, and then research and digitalization. And we'll be promoting that on social media in the next couple of weeks as well. So do watch out for that. So there is a bit of time for anyone to ask any questions, if anybody has any questions.
Hello, can you hear me?
Oh, yep, hi, yep.
Hi, this is Michael Crook from Brighton. I'd like to ask whether the cards have any information about the other organisations which JTS were referring immigrants to get them into these other locations that have just been highlighted. I would imagine they must have worked with a lot of other Jewish organisations. Norwood comes to mind, and possibly others, but do the cards contain any useful information of the sort of stages that they went through to find permanent accommodation? Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, fundamentally, yes. So that kind of information would be contained in the remarks bits. So there's no formal way of writing that kind of information down. However, in the remarks sections, there would have been scribbles about where people went, which organizations they were kind of conversing with about where they could go. And again, I must add as well that actually that's a part of this research that, had I have gone back to again, I think I would have invested a lot more time in seeing those remarks, just to kind of follow those through. Especially, because the temporary shelter, as we saw earlier, was so heavily involved in a network. So ironically, I think what would be an interesting follow-up is seeing how the Jewish temporary shelter itself networks itself within this wide network of charities and other organizations. So it's an interesting point for further research.
We also have a question. Thanks, Michael. Thanks for that. We have a question in the chat from Dan, and that's, Lewis, what other written records are there in existence for the JTS?
That's an interesting one. So the biggest, by far and away, the biggest kind of cluster of records that exist about the temporary shelter, and might I also add records that are kind of post 45 as well. I don't think there are many, but they are contained within the Metropolitan Museum. If that's good, I see Adam nodding.
I think, yeah, I think there's some records in the London Metropolitan Archives relating to the early years. And if memory serves right, I think it's Southampton University which have published records relating to the early years of the Jewish temporary shelter from the late 19th century. And those are available in an online spreadsheet as well. So if you do a Google search for 19th century Jewish temporary shelter, you should be able to find those. The only records we have at the Jewish Museum London are these ones, which relate to the 40s, 50s. So the actual original cards are spread out over a few different locations.
Hi, can I ask a question?
Yeah, please do. Thank you.
Hi, so I volunteer at World Jewish Relief. Was formerly the Central British Fund for German Jewry. I work with the archives there, and I see Jews temporary shelter on a lot of our records. So it's interesting for me to hear it, and the records show often when people are transmigrating, so they've come from Germany or Austria to the UK and possibly settled. Interestingly, your slide showed domestics, and my understanding of a domestic is not someone who works as a housewife or whatever. It's someone who actually worked as a refugee, was able to get a visa to come to the UK as a domestic in someone's home, and that was often the way that many of the refugees, mainly female refugees, were able to come to the UK. But I see Jews temporary shelter mentioned when people are moving from having been here for maybe 4 or 5 years, and then the war is ended, and then they've gone on normally to the States. So were people actually living, or did they stay overnight then, just before they were shipped out, and did the Jews temporary shelter arrange the shipping for those people? Because that's how it kind of appears on my records.
Yeah, thank you. That's fascinating, actually. I'd be quite interested to see some of the records that are available that you've got access to, as I think they complement quite nicely. To basically, yes, so there were a few connections with shipping companies. So actually, you reassured me on my research there as well. Yes, so it would kind of be the temporary shelter would arrange those trips. Incidentally, though, I didn't see many people in these records going to the United States, but that might be something worth looking into, I would suspect.
Yeah, because the records I have access to, generally, a lot of people, well, they came to the UK because that's where they could come to as refugees from Germany or Austria, and then many of them had someone they knew, a family member in America, and they kind of, that was the place people were aiming for. And I haven't had a chance to sort of look back as before I came on this talk, but my impression is that they were then going off to America, because that's mostly where those people went to. But did your records not say that you're saying you don't have many that went to America? Where did they go to then?
Primarily, so the major kind of the major places that these records revealed is primarily England, particularly Liverpool appears quite a lot for people eventually going over to Canada. That's probably the biggest surge there. But we've also got quite a big surge to, oh, my memory serves me correctly,
Palestine, Israel.
again, so because that was another thing that surprised me as well. There wasn't a huge amount of people going to either of those places, but I don't know. That's the trouble with kind of the data focus, is that there's a lot more nuance that needs time and attention, I think. But what I'm sensing here actually is that there's a very interesting opportunity to collaborate.
Yeah, and then are your records, so I have people that contact me looking for their family records, and we can provide copies of the records to the individuals, and I was hoping that you'd be able to sort of say, oh, we can do a search on the names of people and you'd be able to tell us things, but you've taken out the names, have you, from those records for GDPR purposes, presumably, on the Jewish Museum map that you just showed us?
Not wholly. Again, I think Adam is probably best placed to answer this, but we were considerate of GDPR. So where where GDPR was fine based on a couple of calculations, we've kept names in and we've kept surnames in. So that search is broadly still possible, but it's probably easier to search by other things like location.
Right. Okay. No, because a lot of people want to find family records, so we're often having to recommend people go to the National Archives or wherever they want to go to. So I was wondering if I could send them in your or in the Jewish Museum's direction to find out personally when people left on a certain ship and that kind of thing.
Absolutely. So one of the purposes at the start of this was to improve the records that we had about these cards and digitize them. So although we haven't published the names online, we do have the names obviously on the cards and on our in-house database. So the quick answer to this is if anyone thinks they have a relative that would have passed through the temporary shelter in these years, they can always get in contact with us at the Jewish Museum at curation@jewishmuseum.org.uk, and we can do our best to provide you or run searches and try to make anything available if possible. So those details will also be on the web pages when we publish this information.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question. There's a couple of comments, I think, and questions in the chat as well. One is from Maddie. There's a spike in arrivals in the shelter in 1945. And was that solely a result of the Holocaust and number of displaced persons after the liberation of concentration camps? Was there continued anti-Semitism in countries that Jewish migrants and survivors returned to? And did that play a part? And were there any record of these on the cards? I don't know if you came across anything, Lewis, in terms of the anti-Semitism or that aspect of potential reasons why people were migrating. I don't, from my recollection of the information, there isn't much to do with that recorded on the cards themselves, but one naturally can start to make assumptions in some cases as to the movement. And what we should also say is, as well as the cards themselves, several of them have additional correspondence attached to them, which is something we're working on as part of the digitization program. We haven't taken that information into the work that Lewis has done mapping this information because it isn't necessarily part of that mapping story. But again, if people do have any genealogical inquiries or think that anyone they know passed through the shelter, it may be a case that there is a bit more correspondence on that, and we may have some additional information regarding topics like anti-Semitism and reasons why people are moving. Once more, as Lewis said earlier, one of the problems with the data is that sometimes we're reliant on what people recorded at the time, and there isn't always the key information that we're after. So unfortunately, we sort of have to do things on a case-by-case basis. But yeah, you can always contact the Jewish Museum and help with those questions. I think there might be one more question. Helen's thanking for information about the LMA, and once visited the JTS in London, and able to look up the original register and found her great-grandfather's name in there. The family moved here in 1914 and then came and went before that. And I only heard part of what you said, because I'm supposed to work in but those records now be the LMA. I do believe those records will be at the LMA. If you go to the London Metropolitan's Archives website, there's contact information there, and there is a section on Anglo-Jewish archives, and that should reveal a bit more of what's contained within their collection. So yeah, hopefully you'll find those records there, which would be great. I'm conscious of time, and I think that might be all the questions. So I think I'm going to finish now, and just suffice to say thank you again to Lewis, not only for all for the talk today, but all the work you've been doing and creating these visualizations, and especially the map, which I think is going to create lots of interest as well. One final thing to add to everyone who's attended today is that we have a feedback form, as we always do with our talks, and I'm just going to post the link to that. It's a very short form. It should take only 2 to 3 minutes. I've just posted that in the chat, so maybe if people could open that, and it'd be really great if people could just quickly fill that in now. It should take just a couple of minutes, like I say. But otherwise, thank you so much for attending. It's a really fascinating talk, and we hope that you'll come and visit our website once it's up and running. Fingers crossed next week. Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much. Have a great day, everyone.